Imagine that the war ends, the rifles fall silent, the flags fall. The most brutal regime the modern world had ever known collapses into ashes and rubble under the weight of its own monstrosity. And yet, hundreds of thousands of the soldiers who sustained it with their own hands simply disappear. They do not die. They are not captured. They are not judged. They simply evaporate into the post-war fog as if they had never existed. How is this possible? Where did they go? What really happened to the almost 900,000 members of one of the most feared, most lethal, and most criminal military organizations in human history? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give this video a good like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. Today you are going to discover something that textbooks rarely tell with all its rawness. You're going to learn about the secret paths that condemned murderers walked to become respectable civil servants. You are going to follow the trail of war criminals who went from commanding extermination camps to running companies, advising governments, and living placid retirement lives in countries that never knew or never wanted to know who the neighbours they greeted every morning really were. And the most disturbing thing of all, you are going to discover that many of them had help, official help from the very same powers that swore to pursue them to the ends of the earth. But to understand where they went, you first need to understand exactly what it was that the world tried to dismantle in 1945. Because the Waffen-SS was not simply an army, they were something different, something that had not existed before, and that hopefully will never exist again. The history of the Waffen-SS begins, like so many dark histories of the 20th century, with an idea that seemed innocent on its surface. In the early years of the Weimar Republic, when Germany was bleeding from the wounds of the First World War, and popular resentment fermented like poison in a sealed bottle, Adolf Hitler needed personal protection. His speeches ignited passions, provoked riots, and generated enemies at every turn. In November 1922, he created a small group of personal bodyguards that he called the Stoßtrupp Adolf Hitler, the Adolf Hitler shock troop. It was barely a dozen trusted thugs, tough guys willing to use their fists, and something more if the situation required it. When that group evolved and was reorganized under the name Schutzstaffel, the Protection Squadrons, the famous SS, in 1925, no one imagined that that small band of bodyguards would become the most imposing power apparatus of the Third Reich. By 1929, when Heinrich Himmler took control with barely 280 members under his command, the organization was still marginal. But Himmler had grandiose visions. Himmler had patience, and Himmler had the mind of a meticulous bureaucrat, combined with the ideology of a fanatic without limits. What Himmler built over the following years was, in the words of historian Richard Evans, a state within the state. The SS were divided into multiple branches, each with specific functions. The Allgemeine SS, or General SS, were the political and administrative arm. The Gestapo and the SD were the organs of intelligence and internal repression, and the Waffen-SS, which in German simply means armed SS, were the military component, the arm that wielded the weapons on the battlefield. But here is the first conceptual trap you need to understand to follow this story. The Waffen-SS were never simply just another army. From their conception, they were designed as an unprecedented racial, ideological, and military elite. Its members had to meet extraordinary physical requirements: a minimum height of 1.72 meters, perfect teeth, no history of hereditary diseases, and most crucial of all, they had to prove racial purity by tracing their family tree back to at least 1800 or to 1650 in the case of officers. They were, according to Nazi rhetoric, the most refined product of the Aryan race, the vanguard of a new world order. In the early years, the Waffen-SS were relatively small. By the start of the war in September 1939, they had barely 18,000 soldiers organised into 3 divisions. The Heer, the regular army, looked at them with suspicion and a certain disdain. The generals of the Wehrmacht questioned their tactical preparation, their military discipline, and above all, their parallel command structure that answered directly to Himmler, and through him to Hitler, and not to the conventional military chain of command. But the war changed everything. First Poland, then France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Yugoslavia, Greece, and finally in June 1941, the most colossal operation in military history, Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Every campaign, every front, demanded more soldiers, more divisions, more cannon fodder, and the Waffen-SS grew with a speed that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. By the end of 1941, its ranks numbered close to 150,000 troops. By mid-1943, they surpassed 500,000. And by the climax of the war in 1944, the Waffen-SS had reached almost 900,000 soldiers, organised into 38 divisions, with units recruited in practically all of occupied Europe and beyond. There were divisions composed of Dutch, Flemish, Walloon, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, Estonian, Latvian, Ukrainian, Croatian, Hungarian, Bosnian, Albanian, Romanian, and Bulgarian volunteers, and even some volunteers from neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain. It was, in a perverse sense, an international legion, united by the ideology of fascism and anti-communism. Why does all this matter now? Because when we reach May 1945, when Germany signed the unconditional surrender, and the Third Reich ceased to exist as a political entity, the problem the Allied world faced was colossal. What to do with almost 900,000 soldiers who had belonged to an organisation declared criminal? How to distinguish between those who had simply fought at the front and those who had participated in massacres, in extermination operations, in documented war crimes, and how many of them would manage to escape before anyone could even formulate that question? The answer to that last question is the one that should chill your blood, because the majority escaped. Not only did they escape, but many of them built new lives, new identities, and in some cases, brilliant careers in the post-war world. This is that story. On the 8th of May 1945, when Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces to the Allies, chaos was already absolute on the battlefronts. Entire divisions of the Waffen-SS had dissolved prior to the formal surrender. Individual soldiers threw away their uniforms, buried their documents, tore off or burned the tattoos that identified them. The blood group tattooed under the left arm, the unmistakable mark of the SS, and tried to blend into the mass of millions of displaced German civilians, fleeing Wehrmacht soldiers, and liberated prisoners that clogged the roads of a devastated Europe. The blood group tattoo. We must pause here for a moment, because this small, almost surgical detail was going to haunt many SS soldiers for decades. Since 1938, every member of the SS, both the Allgemeine and the Waffen-SS, received a tattoo of their blood group on the inside of their left arm, approximately 10 centimeters below the armpit. It was a practical measure designed to speed up transfusions in combat, but it was also an indelible mark, a sign of belonging that their allies quickly learned to look for. At roadblocks and in prisoner camps, soldiers who raised their left arm and showed that tattoo were separated from the rest and subjected to special interrogations. Some tried to hide it in desperate ways. They burned the area with cigarettes. They made cuts so that the scar would cover the ink. They injected caustic substances. But the mark was deep, and most of the time, the doctor examining the arm could detect the suspicious scar, even when the original tattoo had been destroyed. It was, in effect, a brilliant trap. The Nazis had marked their own elite soldiers in a way that they could not easily deny themselves before their captors. And yet, tens of thousands tried, and many succeeded. How? Why was it possible that the Allied capture apparatus, with all its intelligence and resources, let so many escape? That question has several answers, and each of them is more disturbing than the last. The first answer is simply the scale of the problem. The Western Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and France, had in their custody, in the first months after the war, between 7 and 8 million German prisoners of war. 7 to 8 million. Feeding them, housing them, processing them, and identifying them was a logistical task of almost unimaginable magnitudes. The prisoner camps were saturated beyond all capacity. Interrogators were insufficient. Translators were scarce. Nazi archives were scattered, partially destroyed, or directly unlocatable. In that ocean of confused and desperate humanity, identifying every member of the SS was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. The second answer has to do with the geography of the surrender. The soldiers who had the luck, and yes, it was luck, although the world would prefer to call it something else, to surrender to Western troops rather than falling into Soviet hands, had infinitely greater chances of surviving and eventually being released. The Soviets, who had seen in the flesh what the SS did in the East, the mass executions, the burned villages, the extermination camps, had no inclination toward clemency. An SS soldier captured by the Red Army in 1945 could expect at best years of forced labour in the Gulag camps, at worst a bullet to the back of the head at the moment of capture. That is why, in the final weeks of the war, one of the most extraordinary stampedes in modern military history occurred. Entire divisions of the Waffen-SS that were fighting on the Eastern Front did everything possible to move westward, crossing hundreds of kilometres in chaotic conditions, to surrender to the Americans or the British before the Red Army could reach them. This last-minute tactical decision, this desperate calculation for survival, would save the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers, whose fate would have been very different had they fallen on the other side. The 6th SS Panzer Division, for example, which had been fighting in Hungary, found itself at the end of the war in Austria. Its commander, Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich, known as Sepp Dietrich, one of the original founders of Hitler's bodyguard corps, directed his troops westward with all the speed they could muster. On the 16th of May 1945, more than a week after the official surrender, Dietrich and the remnants of his division surrendered to US troops in Kufstein, Austria. This fact, surrendering to the Americans instead of the Soviets, would be relevant in his subsequent trial. But Dietrich was a known name, a general with rank and recognition. The hundreds of thousands of private soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains of the Waffen-SS did not have that profile. They were anonymous in the mass of defeat. And in that anonymity, they found their first, and in many cases definitive, opportunity to escape. The Allied processing system for prisoners of war was called DISCAMP, Displaced Persons Camp. Alongside the prisoner of war camps proper, there was a parallel system for displaced civilians, the millions of forced labourers, concentration camp survivors, refugees, and German civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. The confusion between these categories was, in the first months, almost total. An SS soldier, who had taken the precaution of getting rid of his uniform and procuring civilian clothes, could, with a bit of ingenuity and a lot of audacity, present himself as a displaced worker of German origin and be processed in a much less rigorous system than that of the prisoners of war. Did this always work? No. Did it work many times? More than any Allied government was willing to admit publicly. Now we come to one of the most debated and controversial aspects of this entire history, a topic that for decades was treated as an urban legend before subsequent historical investigations confirmed it in its general outlines, the escape network known as Odessa. The word Odessa is a German acronym, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, which translates to Organisation of Former SS Members. The question of whether Odessa truly existed as a formal organization, with a centralized structure, financing, and leadership, or if it was rather an informal constellation of mutual aid networks without central coordination, is one that historians have debated for decades. What is not in dispute is the result. Thousands of former SS members, war criminals included, managed to escape from Europe to South America, the Middle East, and other destinations using routes and mechanisms that showed a surprising level of coordination to be improvised. German historian Gerald Reitliner, writing in the 1950s, was one of the first to document evidence of organized escape networks for war criminals. His work was continued and expanded by later researchers like Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who survived the Holocaust and dedicated the rest of his life to searching for the perpetrators, and more recently by historians like Uki Goni, whose book The Real Odessa, published in the year 2002, provided unprecedented documentation on the role of Argentina and the Vatican in facilitating these escapes. What these investigations reveal is a complex and in many aspects surprising system. The rat lines, as they were called in English, were escape routes that took fugitives from Germany and Austria, passing through Italy, especially through Rome and Genoa, to ports from which ships took them to their final destination. Argentina was the most popular and accessible destination, not by chance, but by deliberate design. Why Argentina? Because President Juan Domingo Perón, who governed the country since 1946, had well-documented ideological sympathies towards European fascist regimes. Although Argentina had formally declared war on Germany in March 1945, at the last possible moment, almost when the war was already decided, in order to participate in the founding of the United Nations, the Peronist government never had any real intention of pursuing Nazi refugees. On the contrary, in the year 2000, the Argentine government opened the intelligence archives of the Peronist era, and historians were finally able to document what until then was only speculation. Perón had sent specific emissaries to Europe in 1946 and 1947, with the mission of recruiting German and Austrian technocrats, scientists, military personnel, and industrialists who could be useful for the industrial and military modernization project that Peronism had in mind for Argentina. The recruitment did not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty. What mattered were technical skills, not the past. But to reach Argentina, or Brazil, or Chile, or Paraguay, or Bolivia, one first had to get out of Europe, and to get out of Europe in 1945, 46, and 47, when the Allies controlled the borders and ports and requested documentation from travellers, one needed something that most of the fugitives did not have: valid identity documents under a different name. This is where the story takes one of its most disturbing turns, because the documents were provided in many cases by the Catholic Church, not the Catholic Church as a global institution, with the knowledge and blessing of the Vatican as a whole. That would be too simple. The reality is more nuanced, more complicated, and in certain aspects, more disturbing. What existed was a network of individual priests, bishops, and ecclesiastical officials who, for their own ideological, national, or simply humanitarian reasons, in the most twisted sense of the term, decided to use the Church's resources to help the fugitives. The most prominent name in this story is that of the Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, who resided in Rome and directed the Pontifical Teutonic Institute of Santa Maria del Anima, a German institution within the Vatican. Hudal was a fascinating and deeply contradictory character. In 1937, he had published a book, The Foundations of National Socialism, in which he attempted a reconciliation between Catholicism and Nazism, a theological enterprise as strange as it was unsuccessful that earned him being quarantined by the Vatican, which rejected his arguments. But Hudal never abandoned his ideological sympathies, and when the collapse of the Reich arrived, the Viennese bishop saw the German and Austrian refugees not as war criminals, but as victims of Allied revenge. With access to the logistical and documentary resources of the Church in Rome, and with the cooperation, sometimes active, sometimes passive, of officials of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who were being deliberately deceived about the true identity of the applicants, Hudal helped a significant number of war criminals obtain false identity documents under new names and Red Cross passports, technically known as 10.101 travel documents, that allowed them to emigrate legally. Among those Hudal helped, or who passed through his network, were figures like Franz Stangl, the commander of the Treblinka extermination camp, where between 650,000 and 900,000 people were murdered. Stangl received documents under the name Paul Stangl and emigrated to Brazil, where he worked at the Volkswagen factory in Sao Paulo for years, before finally being identified and extradited to Germany in 1967 to stand trial. Also passing through Rome was Hauptsturmführer Franz Paul Stangl, not to be confused with the former, and figures like Alois Brunner, one of Adolf Eichmann's main collaborators in organizing mass deportations to the extermination camps. But Hudal was not alone in this business. The Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović, who also operated out of Rome and was linked to the Croatian Ustaša movement, itself responsible for mass crimes against Serbs, Jews, and Roma during the war, ran his own escape network under the code name the Rat Line, or Draganović's Rat. Through his connections with the Croatian ecclesiastical hierarchy and his contacts in Argentina, Draganović helped hundreds of Croatian and German war criminals escape, including figures like Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie. That name deserves a pause, because his story is perhaps the most extraordinary and the most shameful for the Western Allies of all those that emerged from this period. Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, for his brutal leadership of the Gestapo in that French city during the occupation, where he was responsible for the arrest and torture of resistance leader Jean Moulin and the deportation of 44 Jewish children from Izur, among other documented crimes, not only escaped justice after the war. He not only escaped, but he was deliberately protected by US intelligence. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented. It is in the declassified archives of the United States Army. In 1983, the US Department of Justice published an official report, the so-called Allen Ryan Report, which confirmed that the US Army, specifically the Army Intelligence Corps, CIC, had recruited Barbie as an informant in 1947 for his supposed knowledge of communist networks in Europe. Why a war criminal? Because in 1947 the Cold War was already underway, and in the new hierarchy of American priorities, fighting Soviet communism had become the central mission. And for that mission, the knowledge of a former Gestapo officer with extensive experience in counterintelligence operations, with contacts in European anti-communist networks, turned out to be useful, convenient, too valuable to waste in a judicial process. The Americans actively protected Barbie for several years, covering him up from the French investigators who were looking for him. When it finally became impossible to continue protecting him in Europe, suspicions about his identity were multiplying, and the risk of a diplomatic scandal was too high. The same CIC agents facilitated his escape to South America through Draganović's network in 1951. Barbie lived in Bolivia for decades under the name Klaus Altmann, even working as an advisor to the Bolivian intelligence services. He was not captured until 1982, when journalist Bete Klarsfeld publicly identified him. He was extradited to France, tried, and sentenced to life in prison in 1987, 4 decades after his crimes. He died in prison in 1991. The Barbie case is one of the most documented, but it is not the only one in which Western intelligence services used Nazi war criminals in the early years of the Cold War. There is a whole category of these stories, a morally unbearable grey area, where justice was deliberately sacrificed on the altar of geopolitics. The most famous of these cases, without a doubt, is that of General Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen was not a member of the Waffen-SS. He was an officer of the Wehrmacht, the regular army, but his story is inseparable from the fate of former Nazis in the post-war period, because what Galen built became the umbrella under which hundreds of former SS members found employment, protection, and impunity in the new West Germany and within the US intelligence system. Reinhard Gehlen had been the head of Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, the German Army's intelligence service dedicated to gathering information on the Soviet Union and the Red Army. In the final months of the war, Galen did something that demonstrated extraordinary cold and calculating intelligence. He ordered all his department's archives, decades of intelligence on the Soviet Union, agent networks, strategic assessments, maps, to be microfilmed and the containers buried in the Bavarian Alps. Then he surrendered to the Americans in May 1945, not as a prisoner, but as a service provider. His offer was simple. I have the intelligence you need on the Soviet Union. You give me freedom, protection, and resources. And we work together. The Americans accepted. It was the era of the rawest realism. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and then the CIA itself when it was created in 1947, negotiated with Galen in total secrecy. The result was the Galen Organization, a private intelligence agency, although financed by the Americans, that operated from 1946 until 1956, when it was transferred to the West German government and became the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or Federal Intelligence Service of Germany, which exists to this day. The problem, the huge, unavoidable, and morally catastrophic problem, is that to build this organization, Galen recruited massively from the former intelligence services of the Third Reich. The Galen organization was replete with former members of the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, and the Sicherheitsdienst. Some of these recruits had direct war crime records. They all had access to protection, clean identities under the denazification system that the Americans had designed, but that the Galen organization helped to bypass for its own agents, and the practical immunity that came from working under the umbrella of American intelligence in the middle of the Cold War. How many were there? Modern researchers, with access to partially declassified archives, estimate that among the agents of the Galen organization, there were several hundred former officers of the SS and the Gestapo, some with names and ranks specifically documented as perpetrators of war crimes. The CIA knew this. Galen told them directly, with no apparent shame, and the Americans accepted it, because in the logic of the nascent Cold War, the utility of those agents against Soviet communism outweighed their past crimes. This decision would have consequences that would last for decades. War criminals who should have been judged in Nuremberg or in the subsequent trials lived quiet and productive lives under the protection, direct or indirect, of Western intelligence. Information about their whereabouts was suppressed or ignored, and when investigators like Simon Wiesenfeld or Jewish victim groups pressed for more investigations, they often encountered unexpected resistance, stemming not from indifference but from active interests in keeping certain secrets well buried. But let us return to the beginning of our story, to the first months after the surrender, when the fate of the hundreds of thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers was still undetermined, because the vast majority of them did not escape to South America, nor were they recruited by intelligence services. The vast majority ended up in Allied prisoner camps, subjected to a process that historians call denazification, and that was, depending on the time, the place, and the circumstances, anything from a genuine attempt at justice to an administrative farce that freed the guilty and absolved crimes with the efficiency of an assembly line. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help with the video's engagement. Okay. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues to recommend our videos. The denazification process was designed at the Potsdam Conference in August 1945 by the four victorious powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In principle, its objective was to eliminate from German political, economic, judicial, and cultural life anyone who had been an active member of the Nazi Party or its affiliated organizations, with special emphasis on the members of the SS, which the Nuremberg Tribunal had declared a criminal organization as a whole. In principle, because in practice, the process was so imperfect, so inconsistent, so manipulable, and so corruptible that the historian Lutz Niethammer titled his monumental study on the subject Die Mitlauferfabrik, the factory of followers, suggesting that what the system mostly produced were not convictions but justifications, not justice but papers that said the bearer had been a passive follower, an insignificant cog in a machine for which he was not responsible. The central mechanism of denazification in the American occupation zone was the Spruchkammer, or denazification tribunals. Every German over the age of 18 had to complete a questionnaire of 131 questions, the Fragebogen, about their political affiliation, membership in party organizations, activities during the Nazi regime, and property obtained during the period. The cases were then reviewed by panels of German citizens, which sounded democratic in theory but created an obvious problem in practice. Who formed those panels in a Germany where practically the entire adult generation had some degree of involvement with the regime? The result was predictable. There were four categories of guilt: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, and followers. The fifth category was the exonerated. In the American zone, where more than 3.5 million cases were processed between 1945 and 1951, when the program was officially terminated, the results were, to say the least, revealing. Barely 1,600 people were classified as major offenders, less than 23,000 as offenders, more than 1.5 million as followers, and almost 1,800,000 were exonerated or classified as lesser offenders, with penalties so small that they practically amounted to exoneration. What happened to the specific members of the Waffen-SS within this system? Here the process was even more tortuous, because the Nuremberg Tribunal, by declaring the SS a criminal organization as a whole, had theoretically opened the door for any member to be automatically prosecuted. But in practice, the Nuremberg Tribunal itself introduced a crucial distinction: members who had been conscripted or obligatorily enrolled in the SS, especially those recruited into Waffen-SS units during the final phases of the war, when voluntary recruitment standards had almost entirely disappeared, should not be treated in the same way as ideologically committed volunteers. This distinction was legally necessary. Toward the end of the war, in 1944 and 1945, when casualties on the Eastern Front were devouring entire divisions, the Waffen-SS had begun to actively recruit, and in many cases force, the enlistment of 16 and 17-year-old youths from the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, and soldiers transferred from other branches of the armed forces who had never asked or wanted to be part of the SS. There was a difference between the ideological veteran who had voluntarily enlisted in the Leibstandarte division in 1933 and the 16-year-old boy who was transferred to the SS in January 1945 without anyone asking his opinion. The problem was distinguishing them, and in the chaos of the post-war period, with archives destroyed and witnesses scattered all over Europe, that distinction was frequently impossible to make. The practical consequence was a system in which the majority of the privates and lower-ranking officers of the Waffen-SS who fell into Allied hands were processed, generally classified as followers or lesser offenders, subjected to penalties ranging from a fine to a few months or years of forced labour, and then released to reintegrate into German civil society. By 1951, when the denazification program was formally terminated, the vast majority of the former Waffen-SS soldiers who had been detained in the Western Zone were free. And what did they do with that freedom? How did these men, that vast anonymous mass of ex-combatants from a declared criminal organization, live in the new West Germany? The answer, once again, is more complicated than anyone with faith in justice would want to hear. In the summer of 1951, in the quiet spa town of Bad Tolz, in Bavaria, the very place where one of the main Waffen-SS officer schools operated during the war, a group of former SS officers gathered to found an organization that would be called HIAG, an acronym for Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the mutual aid community of former Waffen-SS members. The HIAG was not a secret or clandestine organization. It was a legally registered veterans association in West Germany, as public as any other ex-combatants association. It published a monthly magazine. It organized conventions. It had lawyers who represented its members before the courts. And it had a clear political mission to get the veterans of the Waffen-SS recognized as normal soldiers who had done their military duty, and who therefore were entitled to the same pensions and social benefits as the veterans of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. This last part, the pensions, was the central practical issue of millions of lives. German soldiers who had served in the regular armed forces were entitled to war pensions under the legislation of the new Federal Republic of Germany, but former SS members were excluded in principle from those benefits for belonging to a declared criminal organization. Tens of thousands of them lived in poverty, with no right to a pension, with their military skills useless in the civilian job market, and without the social capital that came from having fought under the flags of the legitimate army. The HIAG lobbied, caballed, litigated, and in the end triumphed, at least partially. In 1956, German legislation was modified so that former Waffen-SS members who could prove they had been conscripts, obligatorily enlisted, were entitled to pensions. For many members of the last divisions recruited in 1944 and 1945, this was legitimately fair. For others who had served voluntarily from long before and who benefited from the same legislation, it was one more scandal in a long series of scandals. But the HIAG was much more than a lobbying organisation for pensions. It was a social network, a mutual aid system, a solidarity structure among former SS members that spread throughout West Germany and had branches and contacts in other European countries. Through the HIAG, former SS members helped each other find employment, establish businesses, get references and recommendations. It was, in effect, a very exclusive and very powerful club whose members recognized each other by signals that the rest of German society could not read. The HIAG also had a more explicitly political purpose, the rehabilitation of the memory of the Waffen-SS. Its publications insisted on the thesis, which its critics called the myth of the clean Waffen-SS, that the Waffen-SS had simply been an elite army that fought bravely on all fronts, and that their crimes were exaggerated, distorted, or outright invented by the victors. This narrative, crafted with considerable sophistication by amateur historians within the HIAG and by some conservative academics outside it, found a receptive audience in a West Germany that preferred not to look too closely at its recent past. How much of this narrative was true? The honest answer is almost nothing of substance. The Waffen-SS were directly implicated in some of the most atrocious massacres of the war. In Oradour-sur-Glane, on June 10, 1944, soldiers of the Das Reich Division murdered 642 French civilians, including 247 women and 207 children, by locking them in the village church and setting the building on fire. In Marzabotto, Italy, in the autumn of 1944, soldiers of the SS Mountain Division murdered more than 770 Italian civilians, including babies and the elderly. In the Katowice forest, in Poland, SS units massacred groups of Soviet prisoners of war without trial or process. In Babi Yar, in Kiev, on September 29th and 30th, 1941, SS units, specifically Sonderkommando 4A, murdered 33,671 Jews in a single massive extermination operation in 2 days. And in Malmedy, Belgium, on December 17th, 1944, soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, murdered 84 unarmed American prisoners of war in the field at Banyas, in what would become known as the Malmedy Massacre. This last crime would be one of the most prosecuted in the post-war trials, with consequences that perfectly illustrate the inconsistency and contradictions of the post-war justice system. The Malmedy trial was held in the Dachau concentration camp complex between May and July 1946, part of the so-called Dachau trials, in which the Americans prosecuted several hundred war crimes in the European theatre. 73 defendants, including the operations commander, Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, were tried. 43 were sentenced to death, 22 to life imprisonment, the rest to lesser sentences. Up to this point, something that might look like justice. But what happened next was anything but that. The sentences began to be reviewed almost immediately. The defense attorneys, and here is another disturbing twist, managed to open a US Senate investigation into the trial procedures, alleging that the confessions had been obtained through coercion, mistreatment, and in some cases torture. The investigation by the subcommittee of Senator Joseph McCarthy, yes, the same McCarthy who a few years later would become famous for his anti-communist persecutions, in 1949 concluded that there had indeed been procedural irregularities in some interrogations. The death sentences were commuted. One by one, the convicted men of Malmedy were released. The last one, Joachim Peiper, the direct commander of the operation, walked out of prison in 1956. Peiper, who had been sentenced to death, whose sentence had been commuted to life in prison, which had then been reduced, lived in freedom for decades. He settled in the French town of Traves, in Burgundy, where he lived under his own name. Apparently no one in the village knew who he was, working for the Porsche company. He was murdered in his home in July 1976 by unknown persons, probably members of a French anti-fascist group who had identified him. The Peiper case is emblematic of a pattern that was repeated over and over again in the decades following the war. The initial conviction, followed by commutation, followed by sentence reduction, followed by early release, followed by seemingly normal reintegration into society. The arguments used to justify these releases varied: the needs of German reconstruction, the pressure for West Germany to rearm as part of NATO, procedural problems in the original trials, double jeopardy in some cases, and increasingly simply the passage of time. Time as an ally of the guilty. This is one of the most bitter observations that Holocaust survivors and their advocates made over and over again during the post-war decades. The judicial system has statutes of limitations. Witnesses grow old and die. Memories blur. Documents are lost or destroyed. And the society that suffered the crimes naturally wants to look forward and not backward. For the SS perpetrators who managed to avoid or overcome the first rounds of judicial processing, time was their most precious resource. Every year that passed reduced the possibility of being identified, tried, and convicted. Every year increased the odds that they would die in their beds, at peace, surrounded by family members who perhaps never knew exactly what Grandpa had done in the war. But time also worked for a period in the opposite direction, because while most of the formal judicial processes were winding down in the first half of the 1950s, an event that occurred in May 1960 was going to shake the world and revive the issue of justice for Nazi criminals with a force that no one anticipated. On the 11th of May 1960, in a residential neighborhood of Buenos Aires, Argentina, a team of agents from the Mossad, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, captured a thin 54-year-old official who was walking home from work. The man's name was Ricardo Clement, or at least that was the name under which he had been living in Argentina since 1950. But his real name was Adolf Eichmann, and he was one of the most wanted war criminals in the world. Adolf Eichmann was the head of Section 4B4 of the Reich Main Security Office, the department responsible for the final solution to the Jewish question. In practical terms, Eichmann was the logistical organizer of the Holocaust, the official who coordinated the trains, the deportation schedules, the assignment of Jews from all over occupied Europe to the various extermination camps, the macabre accountant who kept the statistics of the annihilation. His personal responsibility in the deaths of millions of people was immense and direct. Eichmann had escaped from Europe using a false identity, that of Richard Clement, a supposed Italian technician of German descent, and with the help of Draganovich's network and Bishop Hudol. He arrived in Argentina in July 1950 on a ship from Genoa. He settled on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, worked in various companies, including briefly at a Mercedes-Benz plant, and lived with his family under his false identity for 10 years. How did the Mossad find him? The story has several threads. In 1957, a German prosecutor, Fritz Bauer, received information from a Jewish Argentine refugee about a man who claimed to be the father of a young man who had dated his daughter and who had allegedly mentioned having worked with Eichmann during the war. The lead was followed by German agents, who nevertheless showed themselves slow and reluctant to act, which led Bauer to leak the information directly to the Mossad through unofficial channels. The Israelis verified it, and after months of surveillance, executed the capture. What followed was one of the most extraordinary trials of the 20th century. Eichmann was clandestinely taken to Israel, violating Argentine sovereignty in ways that created a diplomatic crisis, and tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial was broadcast on television, one of the first to be so worldwide, and the coverage was massive. For the first time, the entire world could watch in their own homes the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, hear their stories, and confront the monstrosity of what had occurred 2 decades earlier in the heart of civilized Europe. Eichmann was sentenced to death on the 11th of December 1961 and executed in the Ramla prison on the 1st of June 1962. It was, and remains, the only judicial execution carried out by the State of Israel. His ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea, outside Israeli waters, so that he would not have a grave on Israeli soil. The impact of the Eichmann trial cannot be overestimated. It revived worldwide awareness of the crimes of Nazism at a time when many, including the Germans themselves, preferred to leave that chapter closed. It gave new impetus to efforts to locate and try other war criminals, and it produced one of the most influential philosophical texts of the 20th century. Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, published in 1963, in which the German-American philosopher coined the disturbing phrase the banality of evil to describe an Eichmann who, far from being a supernatural monster, appeared to be a mediocre bureaucrat, an unimaginative official who simply followed orders without reflecting on their consequences. Arendt's thesis was enormously controversial, it still is, but it captured something genuinely unsettling about the nature of Nazi participation in the genocide. Not all the murderers were bloodthirsty psychopaths. Many were ordinary people who had made ordinary decisions within an extraordinarily criminal system. And this observation had direct implications for the question at hand. What happened to the Waffen-SS soldiers after 1945? Because if most of them were not exceptional monsters, but ordinary people who had participated in a criminal system ordinarily, if the distinction between the criminal and the normal citizen was less clear than the post-war narrative preferred to assume, then the story of their reintegration into German society was even more disturbing than it appeared. Let's return to West Germany in the second half of the 1950s. The young republic, formally founded in 1949 under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, was in the midst of its Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, growing at extraordinary rates, rebuilding its bombed cities, reintegrating into the Western international community. It was a period of optimism, of energy, of a sense of a new beginning. And in that atmosphere, the question of what to do with the Nazi past was uncomfortable, disturbing, incompatible with the constructive spirit of the moment. Adenauer himself, who was a genuine Democrat and had suffered personally under Nazism, he was briefly detained by the Gestapo in 1944, made a deliberate decision not to make the Nazi past the central axis of the new German identity. This decision had a political rationality. Germany needed to rebuild. It needed the cooperation of millions of citizens whose pasts were questionable. It needed to create a broad base of loyalty to the new democracy. If every former Nazi was treated as a pariah, if every official who had served the regime was excluded from public life, the new republic would not have the administrative cadres or the technical experience necessary to function. The result of this political rationality was that the Federal Republic of Germany was built, to a large extent, by people with stained pasts. Its first federal chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, appointed as his chief of staff and principal advisor Hans Globke, a jurist who had written the official commentaries to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, the laws that stripped German Jews of their citizenship. The first president of the German Central Bank, Karl Blessing, had been an SS member and director of an oil company that used slave labour from concentration camps. The first Minister of Foreign Affairs, Heinrich von Brentano, had collaborated with the regime in various administrative roles, and so on in practically every ministry, every court, every university, every relevant institution of the West German state. This continuity of personnel was not unique to Germany. It was, to a certain extent, the inevitable result of trying to rebuild a modern state after 12 years of a totalitarian regime that had contaminated every corner of public life. But the scale and depth of the continuity in West Germany, especially in comparison with the more rigorous, though also imperfect efforts of denazification in the Soviet occupation zone that would become the German Democratic Republic, was striking. No area better illustrates this continuity than the judicial system. The post-war German judicial system was largely reconstituted by judges and prosecutors who had served the Nazi regime. In 1961, the Federal Agency for Electoral Defense conducted a study that showed that out of the 454 magistrates of the German Federal Supreme Court, the Bundesgerichtshof, 153 had served as judges during the Nazi period, and many of them had handed down sentences enforcing the regime's racial and political laws. What does this mean in practical terms for the SS war criminals who remained in Germany? It means that when finally, in the late 50s and early 60s, German society began to take the prosecution of these crimes more seriously, the judicial apparatus that was supposed to carry them out was contaminated from within. The prosecutors who were supposed to investigate were, in some cases, people who had served in the same system. The judges who were supposed to judge had their own motives for not being too rigorous, and the witnesses who could identify the guilty were aging and dying with every passing year. There is a specific moment in this story that encapsulates all this with almost literary clarity. In January 1958, in the town of Ulm, in Baden-Württemberg, the first major war crimes trial carried out by the West German justice system against wartime Nazi criminals began, not by the Allies, but by the Germans themselves. The so-called Ulm trial judged 10 members of an Einsatzkommando, a mobile SS extermination unit responsible for having murdered between 5,000 and 6,000 people in Lithuania, Estonia, and Belarus in 1941. The result was a series of sentences to between 3 and 15 years in prison that many observers, including the survivors, considered scandalously light given the magnitude of the crimes. But the trial had a crucial secondary effect. It revealed that the judicial authorities of the various German states had no effective way to coordinate war crimes investigations that frequently involved perpetrators scattered across different geographic areas. The problem was that the German judicial system is decentralized. Each state has its own prosecution office, and the war crimes had been committed all over Europe, with perpetrators who had then scattered all over Germany. The answer to this problem was the creation, on December 1st, 1958, of the Zentralstelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, normally known simply as the Zentralstelle, headquartered in Ludwigsburg. This office, which exists to this day, was specifically designed to investigate and prosecute crimes committed during the Nazi period, coordinating the work of the prosecution offices of the different states and maintaining a central archive of cases, suspects, and evidence. The creation of the Zentralstelle was a genuinely important step toward justice. Under its auspices, thousands of investigations, hundreds of trials, and dozens of convictions of war criminals who had spent the post-war years believing they were safe would be carried out in the following decades. But the Zentralstelle also inherited the structural problems of the German judicial system: the slowness, the limited resources, the difficulty in obtaining testimonies and documents from foreign countries, and the passive, and in some cases active, resistance from sectors of the judicial apparatus that preferred some cases not to progress too far. One of the most emblematic cases of this resistance is that of Theodor Oberlander. Oberlander was the federal minister for displaced persons of West Germany in the Adenauer government, a prominent politician of the CDU, the Chancellor's party. But before being a minister, Oberlander had been an SS officer and commander of a special unit, the Nachtigall Battalion, and later the Bergmann Battalion, that participated in massacres of Jews in Ukraine in 1941. The accusations against him were serious and documented. Oberlander was formally accused in the GDR, East Germany, which had obvious political motives to prosecute Western government ministers, which complicated the perception of the case in the West. But he was also investigated in West Germany itself, where, however, the process dragged on for years until Oberlander finally resigned from his ministerial post in 1960, after which the investigations against him lost momentum and were archived. He died in 1998, without ever having been convicted in West Germany. The Oberlander case was not an exception, it was the model. A pattern that repeated itself: the initial investigation, the public pressure, the institutional resistance, the archiving or the acquittal, the death before any satisfactory conclusion was reached. Exceptions, cases where justice actually arrived, did exist, but they were exceptions that confirmed the general rule of impunity. What, meanwhile, was the vast majority of former Waffen-SS soldiers doing, who had neither escaped abroad nor been tried for specific crimes? How did they live? What did they think? Did they still believe in the ideology that had led them to fight under the banner of the Death's Head? Answering these questions requires distinguishing between very different layers of the population of former SS members. At one extreme were the convinced ideologues, high-ranking officers, members with long trajectories, people who had found in the SS not just a job but an identity, a Weltanschauung, a complete and totalitarian worldview. These did not change their beliefs simply because Germany had lost the war. They regrouped, communicated with each other through networks like the HIAG, read revisionist publications, attended comradeship meetings, where the toasts and songs of the old era recalled times that, for them, were not a source of shame, but a source of pride. At the other extreme were those who had enlisted for reasons that had little to do with Nazi ideology, the desire to belong to an elite unit, social or family pressure, the attraction of better uniforms and larger rations in wartime, or simply forced conscription in the final phases of the conflict. For many of these soldiers, the defeat genuinely represented a liberation, a chance to start over without the weight of an ideology they had never fully adopted. Many of them became normal citizens of the new Germany, with nothing in their subsequent behaviour distinguishing them from their neighbours. Between these two extremes was an immense grey area of people who had genuinely believed in parts of the Nazi project, the nationalism, the anti-communism, the idea of German superiority, without necessarily having internalized its most radically criminal aspects, and who now had to reconcile their past with the present. Many of them adopted the tactic of silence. They did not talk about the past. They did not answer questions. They had a sanitized story of their military service. I was on the Eastern Front. It was very hard. Let's not talk about it anymore, which they offered when absolutely necessary and kept the rest to themselves. This generational silence was one of the most defining characteristics of West Germany in the 1950s and 60s. Entire families where the father never talked about the war. Children who grew up without knowing exactly what their father had done during those years. A conspiracy of silence, uncoordinated, but tremendously effective, that protected the guilty from the curiosity of the innocent. There were, however, cases in which that silence was broken, not by the perpetrators who rarely spoke, but by external circumstances that suddenly exposed what time and silence had covered. And when that happened, the consequences could be devastating, not only for the individual exposed, but for the families and communities that surrounded him. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of this period is the history of the former Waffen-SS members who served in the army of the new Federal Republic of Germany, the Bundeswehr, founded in 1955 as part of the rearmament process of West Germany within the framework of NATO. The creation of the Bundeswehr was itself one of the most controversial decisions of the post-war era. Just 10 years after Germany had caused the deaths of tens of millions of people in the Second World War, the Western Allies decided that Germany had to rearm to face the Soviet threat. The decision generated massive protests in West Germany and consternation in countries like France and the Netherlands, which still had fresh memories of the Nazi occupation. To create the new army, soldiers were needed, and more urgently, officers were needed, people with military experience, with tactical training, with knowledge of modern combat. Where would those officers come from? In a Germany that had been completely disarmed for 10 years, there was no alternative source. They would have to come from the ex-officers of the Wehrmacht, and inevitably from the Waffen-SS. The Bundeswehr was designed with a novel philosophical doctrine, the innere Führung, or inner leadership, that attempted to create a model of a citizen soldier radically different from the Prussian and Nazi militarism of the past. The Bundeswehr soldier was not to be an obedient automaton, but a citizen in uniform, who exercised his moral judgment and had the duty to disobey clearly illegal orders. It was a philosophically elevated vision, designed precisely as an antidote against the just following orders that had allowed the crimes of the war. But the officers who were to embody this elevated philosophical doctrine came from the army that doctrine aimed to surpass. The candidate review process to serve in the Bundeswehr, the so-called Personalgutachterausschuss, or Personnel Evaluation Committee, rejected many candidates with problematic pasts. But the selection criteria were not uniform, and the pressures to acquire experienced officers were strong. The result was that a significant, though not dominant, number of the first Bundeswehr officers had previously served in the Waffen-SS. How many exactly? This figure has been the subject of debate and study for decades. The most serious estimates suggest that in the first cohorts of Bundeswehr officers, the people who entered the service between 1955 and 1960, between 10 and 15%, had had some relation with the Waffen-SS. Some had served in units whose participation in war crimes is well documented. Others came from divisions that fought mainly on conventional fronts, and whose involvement in specific crimes was less clear. The most prominent Bundeswehr general, with a past in the Waffen-SS, was Hans Speidel, who nevertheless was never a member of the SS but of the Wehrmacht, and was in fact one of the conspirators in the assassination attempt against Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. But there were generals and senior officers who did come directly from the Waffen-SS and who rose to positions of responsibility in the post-war German army. The most controversial case was perhaps that of General Heinz Lammerding, who had been commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the Das Reich Division, when soldiers of that division perpetrated the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre in June 1944. Lamadin was sentenced to death in absentia by a French military court in 1951. But he lived freely in West Germany, in Düsseldorf, where he ran a construction company, and was never extradited or tried in Germany. Successive German governments rejected French extradition requests, arguing technical legal reasons. Lamadin died in January 1971 in his bed in Düsseldorf. The story of Oradour Saglan deserves a moment of particular attention because it illustrates with terrible clarity the paradoxes of post-war justice. On the 10th of June 1944, 4 days after the Allied landing in Normandy, a column of the 2nd SS Panzer Division arrived at the small village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Limousin region, France. What followed was one of the most atrocious massacres committed by the SS in Western Europe. The soldiers surrounded the village, gathered the entire male population in the stables and barns, and all the women and children in the church. Then they set fire to the stables with the prisoners inside. In the church, they first ignited an ammunition box to create an explosion, and then set fire to the building with the women and children trapped inside. Out of a population of 642 people, almost all the inhabitants of the village, plus some visitors who were there that day by chance, only 6 survived. The exact motives for the massacre have never been completely clarified. The most accepted version is that it was a reprisal for the activities of the French resistance in the region. Although Oradour-sur-Glane was a peaceful village that had no special participation in the resistance, post-war France expected justice. Those responsible were identified, at least partially. Some soldiers of the unit were Alsatians, French citizens who had been incorporated into the SS under coercion when Alsace was annexed to the Reich. This fact created an agonizing legal and moral ambiguity in France, where the Alsatians, considered by many as victims of forced conscription, were tried alongside the German volunteer soldiers in the Bordeaux trial of 1953. The trial ended in convictions that almost no one considered satisfactory. The convicted Alsatians were almost immediately amnestied under pressure from the representatives of Alsace, who argued that their fellow citizens had been victims of the Nazi occupation, not voluntary perpetrators. The Oradour-sur-Glane massacre had to wait until the year 2014 for a German court to convict an ex-soldier of the Das Reich Division for his participation in the crimes, 70 years after the events, when the convicted man was 84 years old and was sentenced to 2 years in prison suspended. This gap between the crime and the punishment, decades of waiting, belated convictions of elderly people, sentences that seem grotesquely disproportionate to the facts, is the hallmark of the entire history of post-war justice for the criminals of the SS. Not total impunity, but something perhaps more disturbing. A delayed, partial, and unsatisfactory justice that arrived too late to console the victims and too softly to deter future imitators. But to speak only of impunity would be to omit an important part of the story, because there were cases, many cases, in which justice did arrive, in which the patient investigation, the perseverance of the prosecutors, the courage of the witnesses, and the pressure of public opinion managed to bring war criminals before the courts and get them convicted. These cases are important not only for what they represent in terms of individual justice, but for what they reveal about the nature of the system that tried to judge the crimes of Nazism. The most important of these late trials was undoubtedly the Auschwitz trial, formerly known as the First Frankfurt trial, which was held between December 1963 and August 1965. This trial was initiated by Fritz Bauer, the same prosecutor who had supplied the information on Eichmann to the Mossad, and tried 22 former members of the staff of the Auschwitz camp, including both SS officers and prisoners who had acted as kapos serving the camp regime. The Frankfurt trial was a historical event of the first magnitude. It lasted 20 months, heard 363 witnesses from 18 countries, and for the first time in West Germany, the crimes of Auschwitz were examined in public and prolonged detail before the eyes of the nation. The trial revealed to a German society that preferred not to know the exact details of what had happened in the camps. The judicial results were, once again, the subject of debate. 6 defendants were sentenced to life in prison. 3 received sentences of between 3 and 14 years. 3 were acquitted. The defense attorneys used arguments that would be used over and over again in the following years, that the defendants were just following orders, that they would have been executed if they refused to participate, that they had no more free will than any other individual trapped in the gears of a totalitarian system. Prosecutor Bauer rejected these arguments with a formulation that remains relevant today. Obedience to criminal orders does not exempt one from criminal responsibility when the crime is so evident, so massive, and so fundamentally contrary to the basic principles of humanity that no moral person can plead ignorance of its nature. The defense of just following orders, codified in the famous Nuremberg Principle 4, which establishes that superior orders do not exempt one from criminal responsibility, was rejected at Nuremberg and continues to be rejected in contemporary international law. The Frankfurt trial also had a profound cultural impact that went beyond the specific convictions. It inspired a theatrical drama by Peter Weiss, The Investigation, from 1965, that recreated the testimonies of the trial in poetic form, and that was performed simultaneously in 16 theatres in Germany and other countries on its opening night. It contributed to the process of awareness of the young German generation regarding what their parents and grandparents had done and what they had known during Nazism, and it was one of the triggers for the student movement of '68 in Germany, which in part was a generational rebellion against the silence and complicity of the previous generation. While German and Allied trials processed a tiny fraction of former SS members, the immense majority lived lives that, from the outside, were indistinguishable from those of any other citizen of the Federal Republic. Among them were factory workers and municipal officials, doctors and lawyers, teachers and merchants, farmers and artisans. West German society had absorbed them, or they had absorbed themselves into it, with an efficiency that reflected both the scale of the problem and the collective will not to look at it directly. How many were there? By the mid-50s, after the majority of the prisoners of war had been released, the last were those in Soviet hands, finally returned in 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. The estimate is that between 450,000 and 500,000 former members of the Waffen-SS lived in the Federal Republic of Germany. Another 100,000 or so were scattered throughout Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and other countries that had contributed volunteers to the foreign SS divisions, and perhaps between 10,000 and 20,000 had managed to escape to further destinations. 450,000 people in a Federal Republic of Germany that in 1950 had 50 million inhabitants, approximately 1% of the adult population, invisible in the statistics, but present in every town, in every neighbourhood, in every workplace. And what they did in those workplaces, how they built their new lives, how many of them kept beneath the surface of their everyday normalcy, the memories of what they had seen and done. That is something that official history rarely examines with the depth it deserves. There are testimonies, not many, because the rule was silence, but there are testimonies from people who in their old age, decades later, decided to speak, sometimes to psychologists or psychiatrists, sometimes to historians, sometimes simply to their own children or grandchildren who had insisted on knowing. What emerges from these testimonies is an enormously varied picture. Some of these former soldiers expressed genuine remorse, an awareness of guilt that had accompanied them for decades. Others showed what psychologists call dissociation, a complete separation between the I of the war, who had done terrible things in exceptional circumstances, and the I of the post-war period, the father, the grandfather, the kind neighbour, as if they were two different people. Others simply denied or minimised. I didn't see anything. I didn't know anything. I was just at the front, shooting at the enemy like any soldier. Psychologist Dan Baron who conducted interviews in the 80s and 90s with children of Nazi perpetrators, including children of former SS members, documented in detail the intergenerational transmission of trauma and guilt in both directions. The children sometimes knew, or suspected, or intuited, and the suspicion, in the absence of clear words from their parents, created its own pathologies. The need to defend the beloved father against accusations that they could not, or would not, examine directly, or conversely, the violent break with a father figure who turned out to be a moral stranger. But not all the stories of former Waffen-SS members in the post-war era are stories of silence and shame. Some are stories of an arrogance that, viewed from today, seems almost incredible, and none illustrates this better than the story of Léon Degrelle. Léon Degrelle was Belgian. Before the war, he had been the founder and leader of the Belgian fascist movement called Rex, which had considerable electoral success in the 30s, before falling into insignificance with the start of the war. With the German occupation of Belgium, Degrelle became one of the most enthusiastic collaborationists in all of Western Europe. He enlisted in the Waffen-SS, despite not being German, which was possible thanks to Reichsführer Himmler's European recruitment policy, and served on the Eastern Front with such courage and efficiency that he reached the rank of SS Standartenführer and received the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves, from the hands of Hitler himself, who supposedly told him, "If I had a son, I would want him to be like you." Degrelle survived the war and escaped to Spain in a plane that crash-landed on the beach of San Sebastian on the 8th of May 1945, the very day of the German surrender, and from which he was pulled out almost dead. General Franco's regime received him, protected him, and allowed him to live in Spain under his own name for decades. Belgium sentenced him to death in absentia. Several Belgian governments requested his extradition. Spain invariably refused. The extraordinary thing about Degrelle was not only that he survived with impunity, but that he had no intention of hiding his past or expressing remorse. On the contrary, during the decades he lived in Spain, he died in Malaga in 1994 at the age of 87. Degrelle wrote memoirs, glorifying his participation in the SS, gave interviews in which he defended Nazism, and became a reference for neo-Nazi groups all over the world. His books, The Russian Campaign, The Epic Adventure, among others, were published in multiple languages and became foundational texts of neo-Nazi historical revisionism. The contrast between Degrelle and, say, Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect, Reich Minister of Armaments, illustrates another of the fascinating paradoxes of the post-war era. Speer, tried at Nuremberg, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the use of slave labour in the armaments industry. But Speer was intelligent, cultured, and articulate, and during the Nuremberg trial he adopted a strategy that distinguished him from all the other defendants. He expressed remorse. Not only remorse, but an entire narrative of having been a victim of Hitler's deception, of not having known about the Holocaust until the end, a claim that later historians have proven to be entirely false, and of having been fundamentally an apolitical technocrat swept along by circumstances he did not control. This narrative saved his life at Nuremberg, where he was sentenced to 20 years instead of death, unlike other defendants with similar responsibilities, and allowed him, after serving his full sentence in Spandau prison and being released in 1966, to build a second career as a memoir author and as a repentant witness of Nazism. His books, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries, sold millions of copies worldwide. Speer became the good Nazi, the comforting exception that suggested it was possible to be close to the absolute power of evil without being completely corrupted by it. It was a carefully constructed fiction, but it was a fiction that the Western public consumed eagerly because it satisfied a deep psychological need. The contrast between Degrelle and Speer is not just about remorse or the lack of it. It is about the narrative each constructed about himself, and about how those narratives interacted with the needs of the societies that received or processed them. Speer gave the West a story of redemption. De Grelle gave the neo-Nazis a story of pride. And in the space between those two narratives lived the immense majority of former Waffen-SS members. Without Speer's intellectual articulation, without de Grelle's monumental arrogance, simply trying to live their ordinary lives with the extraordinary weight of what they had done or seen. A completely different chapter, and in many ways equally disturbing, is that of the former Waffen-SS members, who did not return to Europe but integrated into the armies and security services of the Third World in the era of decolonization and the Cold War. This is an aspect of post-war history that rarely appears in standard accounts, but that involves hundreds and perhaps thousands of ex-SS soldiers. The most documented case is that of Egypt. After the Free Officers' Revolution that deposed King Farouk in July 1952 and eventually brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, the new Egyptian government actively sought military and intelligence advisors who could help modernize its armed forces and develop sophisticated intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities. In that context, several former SS and Gestapo officers found employment in Egypt. Among them was SS Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Becker, who had served in the SS security service and who in the 50s worked for Egyptian military intelligence under the name Ali Becker. Dr. Hans Eiseler, camp doctor at the Mauthausen concentration camp, who had been sentenced to death in 1945 for medical experiments on prisoners, and whose sentence had been commuted, fled to Egypt in 1958 when a new investigation was approaching in Germany. And the most famous of all, Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny deserves a story of his own because his post-war life is probably the most cinematically extraordinary of any former SS member. Skorzeny had been the most famous Waffen-SS officer during the war, not for massacres or war crimes, but for audacious special operations. He was the one who commanded the spectacular rescue of Benito Mussolini from the Gran Sasso mountain in September 1943, landing gliders on the rocky slope and taking the Duce away by plane, right under the noses of his Italian jailers. He was the one who captured Admiral Horthy's son in Budapest in October 1944 to prevent Hungary from negotiating an armistice with the Allies. After the war, Skorzeny was tried at Dachau, but acquitted in 1947. The court found insufficient evidence of specific war crimes, and then he was interned in a denazification camp, from which he escaped in July 1948. With the help of 3 former SS officers, dressed as American guards, he fled to Argentina, where he met with Juan Perón and acted briefly as a security advisor, and then settled in Spain, where he opened an engineering firm in Madrid that served as a front for much more complex activities. Skorzeny became the most famous and best-connected mercenary of the post-war world. He worked for the Israeli Mossad in counterintelligence operations against Egyptian agents, a collaboration that would have seemed impossible given his past, but that was confirmed by Israeli sources decades later. He worked for the CIA in operations in Europe. He worked for Spanish intelligence. He traveled the world offering his services to any government that wanted them, always with that combination of personal audacity and transnational connections that made him unique. He died in Madrid in July 1975 of lung cancer. At his funeral, dozens of former SS officers from all over Europe gathered to pay their respects. His body was transferred to Vienna, where he was buried in the family cemetery. On his gravestone, there is simply his name and his dates of birth and death, no mention of his activities. But let's return to the big picture, because up to now we have talked about exceptions, those who escaped to South America, those who served in foreign armies, those who had extraordinary careers in the post-war era. The story of the majority is less dramatic, but no less significant. For the majority of the former Waffen-SS soldiers who remained in Germany, the post-war period was above all a story of economic reintegration. The reconstruction of Germany demanded labour. The factories that produced the goods of the German economic miracle needed workers. The construction sites that raised the buildings that replaced the bombed ones needed hands. The former SS soldiers, many of them in their 20s or 30s, at the end of the war, in the prime of their working lives, joined this expanding economy with the same anonymous efficiency with which they had joined the ranks of the SS a decade earlier. There was, however, an important difference in terms of social capital and networks. The members of the HIAG and other SS veterans organisations had access to mutual aid networks that facilitated their job search, access to housing, and navigation of the denazification bureaucracy. Those who did not have access to these networks, those who for some reason had been left out, or those who had served in lower prestige units within the SS, were more exposed to the difficulties of reintegration without support. There is a logistical detail of the post-war period that historians rarely mention, but that had enormous consequences for the practical lives of millions of Germans. The problem of documents. Civil, military, and identity records had been destroyed in many cities by Allied bombings. The archives of the Nazi Party and the SS had been partially destroyed by the Nazis themselves in the final days of the war, in an attempt to eliminate evidence. Many German citizens had literally lost all their personal documents in the bombings or in the flights from the Soviet advance. This massive destruction of documents created, paradoxically, opportunities for personal reinvention. A former SS member who claimed that his documents had been destroyed in the bombings of his hometown and that there was no way to verify his claims of being simply a Wehrmacht soldier was not lying in a vacuum. He was taking advantage of a genuine and widespread documentary confusion. Denazification authorities, swamped with cases and with limited resources, frequently accepted these statements without being able to adequately verify them. This problem of documents also had another dimension. The SS archives that had survived were scattered and took decades to be completely catalogued and indexed. The Berlin Document Center, the archive of the Nazi Party, and affiliated organizations that the Americans recovered and managed for decades, took years to be fully accessible to researchers, and its content was crucially important for many late judicial processes. Only when it was finally transferred to the German government in 1994, and its content was progressively digitized, was it possible for investigators and prosecutors to efficiently search for specific names in the SS records. The Berlin Document Center. It is worth pausing here for a moment, because this archive and its history are in themselves a microcosm of all the tensions and contradictions we have explored. In the final days of the war, the central archives of the Nazi Party and affiliated organizations, including membership records of the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, were located in Berlin and in secondary storage locations distributed throughout Germany. When the Americans occupied Berlin, they captured a substantial part of these archives, including the NSDAP membership files, with almost 10 million index cards. This documentary treasure was installed in a villa in the Berlin neighborhood of Zehlendorf and managed by the US Army for 50 years. The Berlin Document Center became the primary resource for verifying whether a specific person had been a member of the Nazi Party, the SS, or other organizations of the regime. Denazification trials, criminal investigations, personnel reviews for the Bundeswehr. Everything depended on the Berlin Document Center to verify or refute the applicant's claims. What was not publicly said for many years, although researchers knew it, was that the captured archives were incomplete. Many records had been destroyed. Others were in Soviet hands, in what would become the GDR. And others, crucially, had never existed in the central archives. The Waffen-SS divisions, recruited in Western and Eastern Europe, had their own registration systems that were partially independent of the central SS archives in Berlin. This meant that for a significant number of former Waffen-SS members, the absence of a file card in the Berlin Document Center was not evidence that they had not been members of the SS. It could simply mean that their particular file card had not reached that archive or had been destroyed. The verification system had, in other words, massive loopholes that those accused in denazification could exploit by claiming that if there was no file card, it was because they had never been members. This whole history, that of destroyed documents, incomplete archives, escape networks, flawed trials, silent reintegration, converges into a question that even today has no completely satisfactory answer. How many of those responsible for war crimes committed by the Waffen-SS were finally tried and convicted? The most honest answer is a very small fraction. The most serious estimates by historians suggest that the total number of people convicted for war crimes committed under the SS banners, in all trials in all countries, from Nuremberg in 1945 up to the last processes in recent years, does not exceed a few thousand. In the context of an organisation that had almost 900,000 members and that was declared criminal as a whole, the percentage of effectively adjudicated responsibility is devastatingly small. And yet, the history of post-war justice does not end in total failure. There are episodes of tenacity, of bravery, and of partial success that deserve to be told, because without them, the picture would be even bleaker. The most notable of these episodes is the story of Fritz Bauer. Bauer was a German Jewish jurist who had survived the concentration camps. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1933, was briefly in the Heuberg camp, was released and exiled to Denmark and then to Sweden, and who returned to Germany after the war with a mission that defined the rest of his life: to ensure that the crimes of Nazism were judged by the Germans themselves, in German courts, under German law, not as a concession to the victorious powers, but as an act of moral responsibility by the German nation towards itself and its victims. Bauer was appointed Attorney General of the state of Hesse in 1956, and from that position fought a battle that lasted 20 years against institutional inertia, political resistance, and the conspiracy of silence that covered the Nazi past of the Federal Republic. He was the one who initiated the process that led to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. He was the one who leaked the information on Eichmann to the Mossad when he saw that the German bureaucracy was incapable or reluctant to act. He was the one who built the documentary cases that served as the basis for dozens of prosecutions. Bauer was aware that his efforts made him unpopular in broad sectors of German justice and politics. He received threats. He had his phones tapped. He lived alone, without family, dedicated completely to his work. He died in July 1968, possibly from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills, although some of his collaborators always had doubts. He did not live to see the most important results of his work, many of which would only mature in the 70s, 80s, and beyond. His figure was ignored for decades in German public memory. He received no state recognition in his lifetime. His name did not appear in school textbooks for generations. Only in recent years, when a new generation of Germans began to critically re-examine the post-war period, was Bauer recognized as one of the most important architects of the culture of historical responsibility that today defines German identity. In 2015, the government of the state of Hesse inaugurated the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt, dedicated to Holocaust research and to perpetuating the memory of his work. But Bauer was not the only one. Simon Wiesenthal, the world's most famous Nazi hunter, deserves a full introduction, because his story, and that of his documentation centre in Vienna, is inseparable from any account of post-war justice for SS criminals. Wiesenthal was born in 1908 in the city of Bukac, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and today is Ukraine. He passed through 12 concentration camps during the war, including Mauthausen, from where he was liberated by American troops on May 5, 1945, weighing barely 56 kilos. Of his extended family of 89 people, 84 had died in the Holocaust. His wife, who had survived thanks to forged documents, was alive. Wiesenthal's decision to dedicate his life to the search for war criminals was, according to his own testimonies, a decision he made in the first days after liberation, He saw how thousands of Nazis fled and dissolved their identities. He saw the chaos of the denazification system, and he decided that if no one else was going to do this work systematically, he would do it himself. He began compiling information for the Nuremberg tribunals, then for various Allied investigative agencies, and finally in 1947, he opened the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Linz, Austria, which would later move to Vienna. For decades, Wiesenthal's center was the main non-governmental agency in the world dedicated to locating, identifying, and providing information to judicial authorities on fleeing Nazi war criminals. Wiesenthal's method was patience and detail. He collected information from survivors, from archives, from leads provided by the public, and patiently built the profiles of the fugitives, their appearance, their habits, their contacts, their possible aliases. When he had enough information, he pressured the corresponding authorities to act. His most notable successes include, besides the Eichmann case, in which his role was more of an initial activator than a principal investigator, the locating of Franz Stangl, the commander of Treblinka, in Brazil in 1967, the identification of Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan, known as the mayor of Majdanek, in the United States in the 70s, and the contribution to the capture of multiple other fugitives in countries on every continent. Wiesenthal also had notable failures. The most resonant was that of Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, the SS doctor responsible for atrocious medical experiments on prisoners, and for the selections on the arrival ramp at the camp, where he decided who went straight to the gas chambers and who was assigned to forced labour. Mengele had escaped to Argentina in 1949, with documents facilitated by Draganovich's network, and subsequently moved to Brazil and Paraguay, when the pressure from investigators began to increase. Mengele was one of the most wanted people in the world for decades. Wiesenthal and his centre repeatedly published his data, his photograph, descriptions of his probable whereabouts. The governments of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, West Germany, and Israel were pressured to intensify the searches. Reports of sightings arrived regularly and were followed up, only to turn out false. The truth about Mengele was only known in 1985, when his remains were unearthed in a cemetery in Embu, near Sao Paulo, Brazil, and subjected to forensic analysis. Mengele had died in February 1979, accidentally drowned while swimming in the sea in Bertioga, a coastal city of Sao Paulo. He was 67 years old. He had lived the last years of his life in increasing poverty, illness, depression, and paranoia, moving constantly between hideouts and depending on the charity of friends and acquaintances from the German community in Brazil. He was never captured, he was never judged, and his victims, those who survived his experiments, the children of those who did not survive, never had the satisfaction of seeing him before a court. Mengele's story is emblematic of another category of former SS members in the post-war era, those who escaped but who lived the last years of their lives in conditions that were not exactly those of a quiet and pleasant retirement. The fear of being captured, the need for permanent clandestinity, the impossibility of speaking freely about their past, the dependence on aid networks that could break at any moment, the certainty that the end, if it came at the hands of investigators, would be jail or the gallows. All this created a way of life that, for many of these fugitives, was a kind of sentence in itself. Not all who escaped, in other words, escaped to a life of luxury. Some lived for decades, with a genuine fear that consumed their lives from the inside. But what happened at the opposite extreme? What did those do who had not escaped and who, for whatever reasons, found themselves in Germany, in Austria, in the Netherlands, in the countries that had contributed volunteers to the SS, in the mid-60s and 70s, when the judicial processes were beginning to accelerate and the pressure of public opinion intensified? Some, when they saw that the investigation was getting closer, fled. Others prepared with lawyers. Others fell into profound denial, convincing themselves that what they had done was not as serious as it was said to be, or that they were simply following orders, or that the time elapsed made any prosecution unjust. And some, very few, made a different decision. They spoke. The testimonies of former SS members who voluntarily confessed their crimes are rare, but they exist, and the psychologists and historians who have studied them see interesting patterns in them. Genuine repentance seems to be more common among those who had enlisted relatively involuntarily in the final phases of the war and who had participated in crimes not as ideologues, but as cogs in a system that had overwhelmed them. Repentance is much rarer among convinced ideologues, for whom rationalization is too powerful a defense mechanism to be overcome. There is, among all the testimonies of former SS members, one that deserves particular attention, not for his notoriety. The individual in question is practically unknown outside circles of specialized historians, but for his extraordinary frankness. Felix Landau was an Austrian SS Untersturmführer who participated in the massacres of Jews in the city of Drohobych, in present-day Ukraine, in 1941. What differentiates him from other perpetrators is that during those weeks of mass murder, he kept a diary in which he described his activities with a disturbing mixture of brutality and everyday detail. He described how he supervised executions and then noted down what he had eaten for dinner, the conversations he had had with comrades, his thoughts about a woman he was in love with. Landau's diary, recovered after the war and studied by historians like Raoul Hilberg and Christopher Browning, offers a chilling window into the psychology of the perpetrators. There is no visible remorse in its pages, no horror, no awareness of doing something fundamentally different from the daily matters of an ordinary life. Genocide appears described with the same banality as a work meeting or a weekend excursion. This is, in its most disturbing essence, Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, not the monster who revels in his wickedness, but the bureaucrat who notes the murders of the day with the same pen with which he notes what he cooked for dinner. Landau was eventually captured, tried in a West German court in the 60s, and sentenced to life in prison. However, he was released early in 1973 after serving less than a third of his sentence, for health reasons. He died a free man in 1983. The pattern repeats itself: the conviction, the early release, death in freedom, as if the judicial system, even when it worked, could not or would not take its own decisions to their logical conclusions. And so we arrive at the heart of the question that we have been circling since the beginning. Was what was done enough? Was post-war justice for the crimes of the Waffen-SS adequate to the magnitude of those crimes? The answer, which no honest person can give otherwise, is no. It was not enough. It was not proportional. It was not up to the standard of what the victims deserved, nor of what human dignity demanded. The reasons for that failure are multiple and complex. The scale of the problem, the documentary difficulties, the political pressures of the Cold War, the infiltration of the judicial apparatus by people with compromised pasts, the collective will to look forward instead of backward. But the reasons do not eliminate the fact. However, this history does not end in 1970 or in 1980. It ends to a certain extent today. Or more exactly, it does not end yet, because the last trials for SS crimes were held in very recent times. In July 2015, Oskar Groening, known as the accountant of Auschwitz for his administrative work in the camp, he counted the money confiscated from the victims upon arrival, was sentenced by a German court to 4 years in prison as an accessory in the murder of 300,000 people. He was 93 years old. He died in March 2017, before entering prison to serve his sentence. In July 2016, Reinhold Hannin, another former Auschwitz guard, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for complicity in the murder of hundreds of thousands of people. He was 94 years old. He also died before serving his sentence. And in July 2020, Bruno Day, a former guard at the Stutthof camp, was given a 2-year suspended prison sentence as an accessory in 5,230 murders. He was 93 years old. These late convictions, convicts in their 90s, who will never serve their sentences, generate mixed reactions. For survivors and their families, they represent a symbolic recognition that the crime occurred, that it was a crime, and that the perpetrator was recognized as such. For many observers, the lightness of the sentences and the age of the convicts makes the whole thing seem more like a symbolic gesture than real justice. And for others, even these late trials are a symptom of an unproductive obsession with a past that should be closed. This last position, that of those who argue that late judicial processes against nonagenarians are more theatre than justice, deserves to be confronted directly, because it represents a thought that, although comprehensible from a certain point of view, contains a fundamental error. The most powerful argument for continuing to prosecute the last living perpetrators is not that of deterrent utility or effective punishment. It is that of the historical record and the dignity of the victims. Each trial, however late it may be, formally establishes that the crime occurred, that it was recognised by society, that the perpetrator was identified and judged. At a time when Holocaust denial is resurging in parts of the world, that formal record matters. But let us return to those who lived their lives without being judged, because that is the history of the majority. In the final years of life of the former Waffen-SS members, who survived into old age without being captured or judged, there is a phenomenon that oral historians and psychologists have begun to document in greater detail: the breaking of the silence at the very end. Not everyone did it, not even the majority. But some, as death approached, felt the need to speak. The reasons varied. Some wanted to free their families from the weight of unspoken secrets. Others felt a religious urgency to confess. Others were simply overcome by memory, by the reappearance in dreams or thoughts of images they had suppressed for decades. And some, perhaps the most disturbing, simply wanted to tell what they had done without anything resembling remorse, as if the telling were in itself a form of liberation that required no repentance. Historians Harold Welzer, Sabine Moeller, and Caroline Chugnall conducted a fascinating and disturbing study in the 90s on family memory of the war in Germany, published under the title Opa war kein Nazi, Grandpa Wasn't a Nazi. They interviewed 3 generations of German families about how they remembered and transmitted the memories of the war, and they found something that defined with surgical precision the mechanism of generational denial. In almost all cases, the family narrative had transformed the soldier grandfather into a passive resistor, a prisoner of circumstances, someone who did not know or who did what he could to protect the most vulnerable. The stories of the grandfathers had been sanctified by temporal distance and the psychological need of the family not to be descendants of criminals. What the study by Welzer and his colleagues revealed was that this transformation was largely unconscious. The families were not deliberately lying. They were remembering in the way the human mind remembers, when the truth is too unbearable, selecting the memories that confirm the image we want to have of our loved ones, and minimizing or ignoring those that contradict it. This mechanism operated on the scale of an entire nation for decades. Germany had a partial collective amnesia, built not on real forgetting. The facts were not forgotten. They were in the books, in the archives, but on the inability or reluctance to apply those facts to the specific people one knew, loved, and respected. The breaking of this amnesia was gradual and came from multiple directions. The trials, as we have seen. The generation of 68, which confronted its parents with questions that had not been asked before. Television. The American miniseries Holocaust, which aired in West Germany in January 1979 and was watched by more than 15 million viewers, left a deeper impression on German public consciousness than all the trials combined, according to polls of the time. And gradually, school education, which began to include the Holocaust and Nazi crimes as a central part of the curriculum. For the former Waffen-SS members, who had lived long enough to witness this cultural shift, the consequences varied enormously. Those who had opted for total silence could maintain it to the end, if their families did not ask, or if they had taken the precaution of not telling anyone anything. Those who had constructed sanitized narratives of their past sometimes found those narratives questioned by children or grandchildren, who had learned in school what their grandfathers had not told them. And those who, rarely, had opted for partial or total honesty, faced reactions ranging from rejection to compassion, passing through the whole gamut of complex emotional responses that this history produced. One thing that is clear from all studies on the perpetrators of Nazism, both those of the Waffen-SS and those of other organizations of the regime, is that there was no single psychological type among them. They were not all sadists, nor all fanatics, nor all opportunists, nor all victims of social pressure. They were people with diverse motivations, diverse personalities, diverse degrees of ideological conviction, who had made decisions in specific historical circumstances, and who had then lived with those decisions in equally diverse ways. This diversity is important to understand, because it makes the simple narrative that the public prefers more difficult, that of the monster who was evident from the beginning, whose monstrosity was visible and recognizable, and who only had to be captured and punished. The reality of former Waffen-SS soldiers in the post-war period was exactly the opposite of that simple narrative. They were indistinguishable from their neighbours, their co-workers, their apartment neighbours. They were, in almost all cases, completely ordinary, and that ordinariness was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Meanwhile, in countries that had supplied volunteers to the foreign divisions of the Waffen-SS, the situation varied considerably. In the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and France, the collaborationists who had served in the SS were prosecuted in waves of trials that began almost immediately after liberation, in some cases even before the formal end of the war. The purge tribunals that operated in these countries between 1944 and 1950 convicted thousands of people, including many former members of the national SS units. In Norway, for example, the Norwegian Vidkun Quisling, whose surname would become synonymous with traitor in several languages, was tried and executed in October 1945. Several hundred of his followers, including former members of the SS Nordland Division, were tried. Sentences ranged from a few months in prison to the death penalty for the most serious cases. In Denmark, the process was similar, although perhaps more extensive in percentage terms, given the size of the country. Several thousand Danes, who had collaborated with the German occupation or served in the SS, were tried and convicted. The debate over the justice of these convictions, over whether the youths who had enlisted in the SS were properly informed of the nature of the organisation, persisted for decades in Danish politics. In France, the post-war epuration, or purge, was massive, but also chaotic in its early stages. It is estimated that between the liberation in 1944 and the following months, several thousand people were summarily executed, that is, without a judicial process, accused of collaborationism. The summary executions included some French former SS volunteers, although the majority of formal proceedings came later. The total number of formal convictions for collaborationism in France reached approximately 96,000 between 1944 and 1950. The case of the Alsatian volunteers in the SS, the Malgré nous, or Despite Ourselves, was particularly complex and painful in France. Alsace-Lorraine had been part of Germany from 1871 to 1918 and was again annexed to the Reich in 1940. Its inhabitants, French citizens since 1918, were subjected to forced conscription into the German armed forces, including in some cases into the Waffen-SS. These Malgré nous were in an impossible position. If they refused to serve, their families were deported. If they served, they were considered traitors by their compatriots. Many of the Malgranaus served on the Eastern Front and died there. Those who survived returned to a France that looked at them with a mixture of understanding and suspicion. Some were tried for specific crimes committed during their service, the Oradour case already mentioned being the most notorious. The majority received amnesties and were able to reintegrate into French society, although the wounds of that history remained for generations in Alsatian society. As we develop this account, there is an aspect we have mentioned briefly, but that deserves deeper exploration: the role of Latin American countries, not only Argentina, although Argentina was the primary destination, as a refuge for former SS members and other Nazi war criminals. Besides Argentina, Brazil was a major destination. The largest country in South America had a very large German community, descendants of 19th century immigrants, especially in southern states like Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, which in many cases welcomed the post-war refugees with ethnic solidarity, without asking too many questions about their past. Brazil also had a government at the time, that of Getulio Vargas in his second term, that had no particular interest in cooperating with the Allied powers in the search for war criminals. Mengele lived in Brazil during his final years. Other less-known war criminals settled in Sao Paulo, in Porto Alegre, in the interior of Sao Paulo state. Some built comfortable lives, others lived on the margins. The German community in Brazil was, like that of Argentina, a space of transition and reception for many of these refugees, although there were also people in that community who rejected the Nazis and who in some cases cooperated with investigators. Paraguay also welcomed significant war criminals. The regime of General Alfredo Stroessner, dictator from 1954 to 1989, was ideologically aligned with European fascism and had no problem offering refuge and protection to former Nazis. Mengele lived in Paraguay for a period. Eduard Roschmann, known as the Butcher of Riga for his massacres in the ghetto of that Latvian city, was located in Paraguay in the late 70s, although he died before being extradited. Chile also received some fugitives, and there is a particularly extraordinary episode that deserves mention: the so-called Colonia Dignidad, founded in 1961 in the mountains of southern Chile by Paul Schaefer, a former Wehrmacht soldier, not of the SS, who had been accused in Germany of child sexual abuse and who fled to Chile before standing trial. Colonia Dignidad became an autonomous, closed German community that for decades was used by the DINA, Pinochet's secret police, as a place of detention and torture for political prisoners. The history of Colonia Dignidad is a dark chapter in its own right, combining Schaefer's crimes with those of the Pinochet regime in ways that are still being fully investigated. Bolivia, finally, was the hiding place of Klaus Barbie, as we already mentioned, and also of other lesser-known fugitives who found in Bolivian political instability and in the remoteness of its Andean valleys the darkness they needed to disappear. The Latin American panorama of Nazi refuge is becoming increasingly well documented by researchers from various countries. The Argentine Ukigoni, mentioned earlier, published in the year 2002 the most exhaustive investigation to date on the escape routes leading to Argentina, based on official Argentine archives that had remained closed for decades. His book demonstrated with documents the direct implication of the Peronist government in facilitating the entry of war criminals and the complicity of sectors of the Argentine Catholic Church in the process. German researcher Johannes Turchel and the institution he directs, the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin, have documented the mechanisms of the European escape networks, and organizations like the Wiesenfeld Center continue working on locating fugitives, although today the number of people left alive with direct responsibilities for war crimes is now very small. At the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, the chapter of the trials of former members of the Waffen-SS and other Nazi criminal organizations is reaching its inevitable biological closure. The last possible defendants are over 90 years old. Some have already died. Most of those remaining are too sick or demented to be effectively tried, The history is closing, not with a grand act of justice, but with the passage of time. But the closure of the judicial chapter does not mean the end of the broader story, because what happened to the Waffen-SS soldiers after 1945, how they escaped, how they lived, how they were or were not judged, how their lives and their crimes impacted their families, and the societies that harboured them, remains a living part of the present. Their children and grandchildren live among us. The institutions that were built to respond to their crimes, specialised war crimes tribunals, international criminal law, the responsibility to protect doctrine, are part of the contemporary global legal landscape. And the lessons their stories offer about the nature of ordinary evil, about individual responsibility within collective systems, about the capacity of time and silence to erase guilt, are lessons that no society that takes its future seriously can afford to ignore. We are barely halfway through this story. There is more, much more. The details of the specific divisions and their individual fates, the history of the pensions and benefits that many of them received from the German state, the history of the organisations that for decades kept the memory of the SS comrade alive, the history of their families and how they transmitted, or not, the truth about their pasts, and the most recent history of the new generation of investigators, prosecutors, and activists who have brought the latest trials to their conclusions. All of that is coming now. Let's start with a story that very few know and that illustrates like no other the complexity of what happened to former Waffen-SS members inside Germany. Not with those who fled to Argentina, nor with those who were prosecuted in major trials, but with those who simply stayed, found work, raised families, and lived their lives, and who nevertheless carried within them a history that the world did not know. In the small town of Wiesenthal in Baden-Württemberg, a carpenter named Franz Reiter, a fictional name but the case is real, worked for 30 years in the same furniture company, was liked by his co-workers, raised 3 children, paid his taxes, voted in every election. He was, by all visible indicators, a model citizen of the new republic. What no one in his town knew, or what no one wanted to know, was that Franz had served as a non-commissioned officer in the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, Death's Head, on the Eastern Front, and that in 1941 he had participated in clearing operations in Belarus that left entire villages turned into cemeteries. There were 20 years of silence between the Wiesenthal carpenter and the SS Totenkopf NCO, a silence so profound that his own children, when they discovered it after his death while going through his stored documents, took months to process what they held in their hands. This story was multiplied by tens of thousands across all of Germany. It was the story of an entire generation that had participated in something monstrous, and then had built normal lives without processing, without talking about, and without fully accounting for what they had done. The sociology of this massive silence is one of the most extraordinary and least studied phenomena of the European 20th century. The American historian Robert Gellatley, a specialist on the Nazi regime, argued persuasively in his book Backing Hitler that popular support for Nazism in Germany was much broader and more active than the post-war narrative preferred to acknowledge. The idea that Germans did not know what was happening in the camps, that they were passive victims of a small group of fanatics who had taken control of the state, was demolished by successive historical investigations that demonstrated that information about the deportations, the mass shootings, and the conditions of the camps was known in greater or lesser detail by broad sectors of German society. If this was true for society in general, it was infinitely more true for the members of the Waffen-SS, who in many cases had been direct witnesses to the worst atrocities. The members of the divisions that fought on the Eastern Front, especially in the pacification operations behind the front lines, knew exactly what was happening. They had seen the executions, they had heard the shots. In some cases, they had participated directly in them. And then, with the end of the war, they had turned the page and begun the next chapter of their lives. How is that done? How do you go from participating in the mass murder of civilians to working as a carpenter in a German town and raising your children without anyone knowing? Psychologists who have studied this phenomenon offer various answers. Mental compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of one's life into hermetic boxes, is one of them. Rationalization, the construction of narratives that justify what was done. It was the war. There was no other option. If we didn't do it, others would. The enemy was worse, is another. And simple denial of reality, the unconscious decision not to think about certain memories, not to allow oneself to relive them, is perhaps the most common. But there is something else that explains this massive silence, and that is the social complicity that surrounded it. In a society where tens of thousands of people had similar pasts, where silence was the norm and not the exception, where speaking out meant exposing oneself and possibly exposing others, the pressure towards silence was enormous and implicit. A formal conspiracy was not needed. It was enough for everyone to understand that there were certain questions that were not asked, certain stories that were not told, certain pasts that were not examined. This complicity of silence was reproduced in institutions, in companies, which hired former SS members without asking too many questions, because any serious investigation could prove uncomfortable for too many. In the courts, where judges with stained pasts had personal reasons not to be too rigorous, with others who found themselves in similar situations. In the churches, which had failed to resist Nazism and which preferred to turn the page rather than confront that collective failure. In the universities, where professors who had served the regime taught the new generation, without ever explaining what they had done during the dark years. University education in West Germany in the 50s and 60s was one of the spaces most contaminated by this silent continuity. The generation of students that arrived at the universities in those years was taught in many cases by professors who had actively participated in the intellectual project of Nazism, historians who had written justifications for German expansionism, philosophers who had provided theoretical cover for racial ideology, jurists who had developed the regime's legal scaffolding, doctors who had participated in euthanasia programs or in camp experiments. Some of these professors had gone through the denazification process and had been whitewashed through favourable classifications. Others simply were never investigated because their fields of specialty did not seem directly relevant to the most obvious crimes. But all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, had been part of the Nazi project, and their presence in the classrooms of post-war Germany was a living contradiction to the democratic values that the new republic professed. The rebellion of the generation of 68 in Germany had, unlike its counterparts in France or the United States, a specifically anti-Nazi dimension. The German students of that generation were not simply protesting against the Vietnam War or for civil rights. They were confronting their own parents and teachers with questions that no one had answered satisfactorily. What did you do during the war? Was the question that defined the relationship between the generations, and the answer, when there was an answer, was rarely satisfactory. Rudi Dutschke, the most charismatic student leader of the German 68 movement, articulated this generational confrontation in terms that still resonate. The new Germany could not be built on silence and denial of the past. It had to confront that past directly if it wanted to be genuinely different from what it had been. This demand for direct confrontation clashed with the older generation, including many former SS members, who were now respectable fathers and grandfathers, with an intensity that sometimes produced irreparable family rifts. But generational confrontation, as necessary as it was not enough to produce justice. Justice, if we understand by justice not only the recognition of the crime, but the criminal responsibility of the perpetrator, required something more than confrontations at the family dinner table or debates on university campuses. It required the effective functioning of a judicial system willing and able to act. And here we come to one of the most technically complicated aspects of this entire history, The problem of statutes of limitation. In German law, criminal offences have statutes of limitation. After a certain time, a crime can no longer be judicially prosecuted. For murder, the period in original German legislation was 20 years. This meant that crimes committed between 1939 and 1945 would expire between 1959 and 1965, precisely when the major trials were beginning to gain momentum. In 1965, the German parliament debated this problem directly. Should the statute of limitations for Nazi crimes be extended or eliminated? The debate was agonizing and revealing. Those who wanted to maintain the original prescription argued that the principles of the rule of law could not be modified retroactively, that legal certainty required that after a certain time, criminal prosecution must cease. Those who wanted to eliminate it argued that crimes of the magnitude of the Holocaust were imprescriptible by nature, that civilization could not establish a time limit for genocide. The Bundestag decided in 1965 to extend the statute of limitations for Nazi murder crimes until 1969, granting 4 more years. In 1969, with another equally agonizing debate, it extended the deadline until 1980. And in 1980, finally, it abolished the statute of limitations for murder, making crimes of that category imprescriptible. This was crucial for the late trials of the following decades. But even with the theoretical imprescriptibility of murder, the effective prosecution of Nazi crimes continued to encounter formidable practical obstacles. The most important of all, with the passing of the years, was simply the age and death of possible witnesses and defendants. The camp survivors who could identify their perpetrators were dying. The defendants themselves were dying before the cases against them could be completed, and the memories of those who remained alive blurred with time, making them more difficult to use as evidence in a judicial process. There is a cruel mathematics here that no one could avoid, for the crimes committed between 1939 and 1945. Every year that passed without a trial was a year added to the probability that the trial would never arrive. The investigators and prosecutors working on these cases in the 70s, 80s, and 90s were literally racing against the biological clock. The Zentralstelle in Ludwigsburg, the central office for the investigation of Nazi crimes mentioned earlier, issued thousands of investigations and hundreds of cases to the prosecution offices of the various German states in its years of existence. But the conversion rate from investigation to conviction was always very low. Out of the many thousands of investigated cases, only a few hundred resulted in convictions. And of those convictions, many were appealed, reduced, or annulled due to procedural deficiencies, due to the death of the accused during the process, or due to the absolute absence of witnesses who could testify directly about the specific alleged facts. One of the most painful cases in this regard is that of Karl Wolff, the SS Obergruppenführer and general of the Waffen-SS, who was the primary liaison between Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler, and who was responsible for organizing the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews to the extermination camps. Wolff was tried in Munich in 1964, 19 years after the end of the war, and sentenced to 15 years in prison for complicity in murder. He was released in 1971, after serving less than 8 years. He lived until 1984, when he died at the age of 84 in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was never prosecuted again. Faced with these failures of formal justice, there emerged, and there continue to exist, less formal but no less important forms of responsibility. Historical responsibility, the documentation of crimes in publicly accessible archives, the education of future generations, the memory of the victims kept alive by their descendants and by the communities that lost them. These forms of responsibility do not send anyone to jail, but they have an importance that transcends the judicial process. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, was inaugurated in 1953 and has over time become the most complete archive in the world on the Holocaust. Its databases contain the names of 6 million identified victims, out of the 6 million Jews murdered in total. in addition to exhaustive documentation on the perpetrators, the units, the methods, and the geography of the genocide. This documentation has no direct legal value, but it has an immeasurable historical and memorial value. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, inaugurated in 1993, has gathered for the American and global public the history of the genocide, with an unprecedented documentary and narrative richness. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, inaugurated in 2005, a field of 2,711 concrete stela of varying heights, covering almost 20,000 square meters in the center of the German capital, is the German state's most visible recognition of its historical responsibility. These memorials and museums are important not only for what they preserve, but for what they exclude, the possibility of forgetting. In a society that literally built a monument to genocide in the heart of its capital, the argument that we didn't know or that it was too long ago to matter loses substance. Institutionalized memory acts as a counterweight to individual and collective amnesia. But let's return to the perpetrators, because there are still aspects of their history that we have not explored. One of them is the economic dimension. What happened to the money and goods obtained during the Nazi period? This question, which seems prosaic compared to the issues of life, death, and justice that we have been exploring, has enormous practical relevance, because the Nazi regime was, among other things, the most efficient looting apparatus in modern history. The systematic theft of assets from Jewish victims, properties, businesses, money, artworks, jewelry, even the gold teeth from the corpses in the camps, had generated a fortune of incalculable dimensions that flowed toward the Reich, toward party institutions, and in many cases into the individual pockets of those who administered the system. How much of that stolen money ended up in the hands of former SS members who built businesses and comfortable lives in the post-war period? It is a question that historians have begun to examine systematically only in recent decades, with disturbing results. Investigations into Swiss banks, German companies, and real estate properties in various countries have revealed that considerable amounts of wealth stolen from Holocaust victims survived the war and integrated into the legal financial system of the post-war era, where it lost its illicit origin under layers of transactions and decades of time. The restitution process, returning stolen assets to victims or their heirs, began in Germany in the 1950s, with compensation legislation, Wiedergutmachung, and continued with specific processes for Swiss bank accounts, artwork, and properties. But the process was always incomplete, belated, and often unsatisfactory for the heirs of the victims. Many assets were never recovered. Many properties had changed hands multiple times, and their current owners had no knowledge of their illicit origin. And the victims' heirs, in cases where heirs existed, because entire families had been exterminated, frequently had difficulties proving their claims with the documentation required by judicial and administrative systems. The issue of pensions for former Waffen-SS members, which we mentioned briefly in the context of the HIAG, deserves a more detailed treatment, because the story of how West Germany handled the pension claims of its former SS soldiers is, in microcosm, the entire history of how that society dealt with its Nazi past. The German war pension legislation, the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, or BVG, came into force in 1950. In principle, former members of the SS were excluded from its benefits for belonging to an organisation declared criminal. But in practice, the exclusion was much harder to apply than it seemed in theory. Why? First, because as we mentioned, the distinction between those who had served voluntarily and those who had been conscripted was frequently impossible to establish. Second, because many former SS members had served in other branches of the armed forces before being transferred and could claim benefits for that prior service. Third, and most importantly, because the courts reviewing pension denials tended to resolve doubts in favour of the applicant, not of the exclusion. The result was that tens of thousands of former Waffen-SS members ended up receiving war pensions from the West German state. Not as former SS members, that category remained excluded in principle, but through various legal fictions that allowed them to be classified as normal military servants, whose service in the SS was treated as circumstantial. How much money did this represent? No one has done the complete calculation, but the scale was enormous. With 450,000 or more former Waffen-SS members in Germany, even if only a fraction of them received a pension, the cost to the state was substantial. And that pension, in many cases, was received by people whose names appeared in the SS archives as participants in extermination operations that had never been judged. There is one aspect of the history of former Waffen-SS members in the post-war era that is particularly difficult to treat without falling into simplifications that do not do justice to the complexity of reality, the question of those who genuinely changed. Human beings have a capacity for moral change that cannot be ignored, not even when that person's past includes serious crimes. The question of whether genuine repentance, a radical change of life, dedication to principles opposed to those that guided the previous crime, can or should have legal and moral consequences, is one of the most difficult in moral philosophy and criminal law. There were, among former Waffen-SS members, some cases of genuine conversion, people who after the war broke completely with their ideological past, who cooperated with war crimes investigations, who supported Holocaust education efforts, who dedicated part of their lives to working for reconciliation and understanding. These cases are rare, but they exist, and they deserve to be mentioned not as an exculpation of their crimes, but as a testament to the human capacity for change. The most cited case in this regard is that of Oskar Schindler, who nevertheless was a member of the Nazi Party and the military Abwehr, not the SS, whose story was popularized by Steven Spielberg's film. But there are lesser-known cases specifically within the context of the Waffen-SS. Albert Conrad Gemmerke, the commander of the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands, from where more than 100,000 Dutch Jews were deported to the extermination camps, was sentenced by a Dutch court in 1949 to 10 years in prison. After his release, he settled in Dusseldorf and never returned to public life. But in the following years, testimonies from former Westerbork prisoners described Gemmerke as a commander who, within the margin of possibilities he had, treated the prisoners with greater humanity than the system would have demanded. This description does not absolve him of his responsibility in the deportations. He was the camp commander, and the deportations would not have been possible without his cooperation. But it offers a more nuanced picture than the simple narrative of perpetrator monster allows. Nuance is important, not to exculpate, not to create false equivalencies between victims and perpetrators, but to understand more precisely how participation in collective evil works, by what mechanisms it operates, how it can be resisted and how it cannot. Because that understanding is what allows, not only historians, but any society that wants to learn from the past, to identify the factors that make genocide possible and those that can prevent it. This is ultimately the reason why the history of what happened to the Waffen-SS soldiers after 1945 remains relevant today, not as an exercise in historical curiosity, not as a retroactive accusation against the dead, but as a living lesson on how societies produce collective crimes, how they manage their responsibility with those crimes, and what happens when that responsibility is not handled properly. The consequences of the partial impunity that characterized the German post-war period were not only individual, they affected political culture, law, education, the way Germany related for decades to its own past, and the corrections that were gradually produced, the late trials, the development of international criminal law, the culture of institutionalized memory, are also the product of that initial failure. They are, in a certain sense, society's response to its own errors. Today, in the year 2026, the last possible defendants are reaching the end of their lives. The judicial chapter closes, with all its imperfection, with all its dissatisfaction. But the historical and moral chapter remains open. and will remain open as long as the generations that inherited this past, directly or indirectly, continue to seek ways to understand it, to honour its victims, and to build on its ruins something that can more properly be called justice. But before closing this first part, there is an essential element that deserves attention: the fate of the foreign soldiers who served under the banner of the SS. By 1945, approximately 40% of the Waffen-SS personnel was not of German or Austrian nationality. There were entire divisions composed of Dutch volunteers, the Nederland Division, of Flemish volunteers, the Landmark Division, of Walloon volunteers, the Wallonie Brigade, commanded by the already mentioned Leon de Grelle, of Scandinavian volunteers, grouped in the Nordland Division, of Baltic volunteers in Latvian and Estonian divisions, of Ukrainian volunteers in the Galician Division, of Bosnian Muslim volunteers in the Handschar Division, and of volunteers of dozens of other nationalities in smaller units. The fate of these foreign SS combatants at the end of the war was in many cases worse than that of their German comrades. While the Germans could at least expect to be processed by the denazification system, imperfect but existent, and eventually released to reintegrate into German society, the foreigners faced the additional prospect of being tried as traitors to their own nations. The Dutch volunteers, who survived and returned to the Netherlands, were tried before Dutch courts for collaborationism and treason. Penalties ranged from several years in prison to, in the most serious cases, the death penalty. Dutch society, which had suffered severely under the German occupation, had little patience for those who had chosen to put on the SS uniform. The total number of Dutchmen who served in the Waffen-SS during the war is estimated at approximately 23,000. A significant proportion of them died on the Eastern Front. Those who survived and returned faced judicial processes, social exclusion, and the impossibility of reintegrating normally into a society that looked at them with contempt. The situation of the Flemish volunteers, Dutch-speaking Belgian citizens, was equally difficult, but it added a complex national identity dimension. Flemish collaborationism with the Nazis had roots in the resentment of the Flemish minority toward Walloon dominance in Belgium, which complicated the simple narrative of treason. The Flemings who had served in the SS were seen by part of the Flemish community as misguided patriots, rather than as simple traitors, which generated tensions within Belgian society that took decades to resolve. Scandinavian volunteers, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Finns, faced similar processes of exclusion and trial in their countries of origin. In Norway and Denmark, former SS volunteers were tried for treason. In Sweden and Finland, which had not been occupied and therefore did not have collaborationism laws applicable in the same way, the treatment was more ambiguous. Some Swedish volunteers who had served in the SS simply returned to Sweden after the war without facing any legal consequences, although they did face social ostracism. The story of the Baltic combatants, Estonians and Latvians, who had served in the SS divisions of their respective nations, is perhaps the most complicated of all. These soldiers came from countries that had been occupied first by the Soviet Union in 1940, then by Germany since 1941, and again by the Soviets since 1944. For many of them, the choice to serve in the Waffen-SS was not an expression of ideological sympathy with Nazism, but a response to the alternative, being conscripted into the Soviet Red Army, which from their perspective was the occupier that had deported tens of thousands of their compatriots to Siberia in 1940. This complexity makes the simple categorization of SS volunteer inadequate to describe many of these soldiers. For the Estonians and Latvians, their divisions were seen in their own communities, not as ideological elite corps of Nazism, but as the only military units available to defend their national territories against the Soviet return. This argument has a certain historical validity, but it has a crucial limit. Regardless of individual motivations, the units in which they served were part of the Waffen-SS, an organization that committed documented war crimes. The issue of the status of the veterans of the Baltic SS divisions became a point of political conflict after Estonia and Latvia regained their independence in 1991. The veterans of these divisions held annual meetings in Riga and Tallinn that generated protests from the Wiesenthal Centre and diplomatic tensions. The Latvian and Estonian governments found themselves in an awkward position. They recognised that these veterans had served in a criminal organisation, but they also did not want to deny the national narrative of resistance to Soviet totalitarianism that many of their citizens associated, in a historically inaccurate but emotionally understandable way, with that service. The history of the Bosnian Muslim volunteers of the Handschar Division is another disturbing chapter. The Handschar Division, a name taken from the traditional curved sabre of the Ottoman Janissaries, was established by Himmler with the idea of recruiting Bosnian Muslims, who, according to his twisted worldview, were Aryans of Slavicized lineage. The division committed serious crimes against Serbian and Jewish civilian populations in Bosnia during 1943 and 44. The Bosnian volunteers who served in the Handschar had highly varied destinies after the war. Some died in combat, some fell into Yugoslav hands and were executed by Tito's regime as collaborationists. Others escaped and scattered throughout the Middle East and other regions of the Muslim world. In this whole history of the foreign divisions of the Waffen-SS, there is a paradox that deserves to be mentioned. The fact that an organisation built explicitly upon the ideology of Aryan racial superiority ended up massively recruiting among people that ideology considered racially and ideologically inferior, Slavs, Bosnian Muslims, Croats, demonstrates the gap that frequently existed between the ideological rhetoric of Nazism and its practical needs. The war devoured the purest ideology of the SS with the same ferocity with which it devoured everything else. In the final years of the war, with massive casualties and desperate pressure for more soldiers, the Waffen-SS went so far as to recruit not only non-German Europeans, but also members of Arab communities from various Middle Eastern countries who saw in Germany an ally against British colonialism. The organisation that Himmler had conceived as the Aryan racial elite of the world had become, in its final phases, an amalgam of volunteers and conscripts of such diverse origins that they would have horrified the racial purity theorist who recruited them. This evolution says something important about the ultimate nature of the Waffen-SS. More than a coherent ideological project, they were a war machine that consumed what it found in its path. And when that machine stopped in May 1945, the problem that remained was neither abstract nor theoretical. It was that of almost 1 million people of dozens of nationalities who had been part of it, who had seen and done things that the world wanted to forget, and who now had to find a place in a world that no longer wanted them. And what happens when those people find that place? When they settle down, raise children, grow old, and die surrounded by people who never really knew who they were? What kind of society does that silence build? And what kind of wounds does it leave?